Hi, this is Brass Check, and I am recording this on Friday, October 4th. And let's see if I can get the technology to work. Exclusive New York City health officials to hold bird flu tabletop exercise. This is October 3rd, 2024. New York City officials are planning a tabletop simulation later this month to prepare for a hypothetical bird flu outbreak. A city health guide revealed a city health official revealed at the International Bird Flu Summit taking place this week in Fairfax, Virginia. So we have to keep our eyes on these people because we never know when they're going to try to spring another one on us. I want to send you something that's going to be connected to this video that I'm making right now that shows a video that we made very, very early in the spring of 2020 to show you exactly how these scams work. And I'm going to get out of share and hopefully if all goes well, the video will play right now.
The Centers for Disease Control this past week quadrupled its estimated H1N1 flu virus death toll to roughly 3,900 between April and mid-October. For more on the outbreak, we are joined by Dr. Anthony Fauci, the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Dr. Fauci, good evening to you.
Good evening.
Despite those numbers we just gave, this past week in this country, the reported number of cases of H1N1 were down. Should we be encouraged by that?
I think it's really premature to get any encouragement for that. There was a little blip down in the pattern of the number of cases. But since flu is eminently unpredictable, I think it's really dangerous to make any assumptions as what's going to happen over the next few weeks or months. It could have peaked and then might come down. That would be wonderful if that happens. Or it could peak and then taper off like this, which means there'd be many more cases of influenza. Or it could peak, come down, and then in the middle of the winter, we could have a second wave. So I think we ought to refrain from making any kind of conclusions about the patterns based on a single week's tally.
Hello, welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm Cheryl Atkinson. If you've been diagnosed with probable or presumed 2009 H1N1 or swine flu in recent months, you may be surprised to know this. The odds are you didn't have H1N1 flu. In fact, you probably didn't have flu at all. That's according to state-by-state test results obtained in our 3-month-long CBS News investigation. In short, only a small fraction of cases that doctors flagged as most likely to be swine flu actually tested positive for swine flu at state labs. The vast majority of the cases were negative. Joining us to talk about our findings is Alicia Mundy, reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and Politico's Fred Barbash. First, a little background. Alicia, when the government first feared this was going to be perhaps an even more serious epidemic, a public health emergency was declared and a number of measures were triggered. What were some of them?
Well, and as background, at the beginning of the year, there was a peanut scare, as you know, and the FDA was caught flat-footed, so they came into this with guns blazing. And first thing they did was they issued an emergency use authorization, which is a special release for creating a test for the flu without going through major clinical trials. Get that out there so that people can use it. And then there were two medicines, the inhaler Relenza and the flu medicine Tamiflu. They allowed expanded uses for them, such as Tamiflu for infants, which it had never been approved for, so that they could make sure there were stockpiles of medicine and that people had tests available to get with it.
All seemed to make sense, obviously, at the time. We were dealing with a lot of unknowns. What we found was by the third week in July, the CDC advised states to stop testing for individual cases of H1N1 flu, and they stopped counting individual cases. The rationale that the CDC gave was, well, why continue wasting resources tracking when we already have established there is an epidemic? But there's some disagreement on the strategy as to whether or not these individual cases should be tracked.
Well, for instance, Bernadine Healy, the former director of NIH, has written recently that she's very concerned that we are, I believe her word was, guesstimating instead of actually calculating. And the result from that, according to her and doctors I've called in the past day or so, are just that we could be overloading emergency rooms with people who don't have the flu. We're going to be using up medicine that might not be needed, and there's just a host of other resources that are taken up. And some of the doctors and researchers like Bernadine Healy are saying, hey, we really need to stick with numbers the way we always have instead of just, random guesses.
Well, the other ramifications are once you've had the H1N1 flu, you're believed to be immune from the same virus. So those who think they've had it but haven't might mistakenly think they're immune, and they might forego the vaccine that they ought to have. And on the other hand, if you really have had it, CDC is saying go ahead and get the flu shot anyway since you're not sure, but that's using up a limited amount of vaccine when we're hearing there are shortages. So it's hard that we haven't tracked this. I want to go now to Fred Barbash from Politico to talk briefly about the Brookings Institute study that's coming out just today. What did it find?
Well, this is a study of the costs and benefits of closing schools when you have an epidemic or a near epidemic situation. And of course, if you do a Google search, you'll find that there's schools all over the country that are closing, in townships here and there, cities all over the country, all over the world. And basically what the Brookings study shows is that there's significant cost to this, not just in dollars, but in terms of the stress on the healthcare system. Because when you close school, there's a knock-on effect on the labor force. Part of that labor force is healthcare workers from the hospitals and the clinics. And people have to stay home rather than go to work. And if their work happens to be helping people who have the flu or who are in an emergency room, then that's going to put more stress on the system. The other thing that's noted in that study is that a lot of schools are now functioning as medical care institutions. They're doing vaccinations in the schools, there are clinics in the schools, there are nurses in the schools. So I think the point is that carefully consider the costs and the benefits before you immediately rush to close a school for fear that the virus will spread like wildfire through the school. The virus, certainly I can tell you from my own experiences, the virus is spreading like wildfire, but whether the schools any school ought to be closed down, the Department of Education says only when absolutely necessary.
Now, we wanted to hear from CDC when we found that these figures, the high negative rate among those cases considered to be most likely to be swine flu. And they wouldn't answer Freedom of Information requests that we filed. They wouldn't answer questions that we posed to them. And we approached Dr. Frieden, who heads CDC, at an unrelated news conference to confront him about this lack of information. Here's that tape.
Dr. Frieden, I'm Fernando Suarez with CBS News. I work with Cheryl Atkinson from our investigative department. This is on a separate issue. For weeks, we've been trying to get information from your office on the state-by-state breakdown of the H1N1 virus, and your office has been obstructing the release of that information. Can you assure us that you would personally look into this so that we can get that public information released today?
We will certainly look into it. We do work in partnership with states and coordinate with them on release of data that is data reported to CDC by state government. So it's a question of coordinating with the states on release of information. I'd like to see if there are other questions, perhaps on the...
One last question. The information is available to the CDC right now. What can we do to get that information released to us today? Your office has stopped communicating with us about this issue, so we had to come down here to ask you personally to get involved.
I am aware of the issue. We are discussing with states because some of the states have provided to us preliminary or incomplete data, and we need to make sure that any data we release to the public is accurate and that the entities that have reported are comfortable that that data actually represents what they intended to report. So once we are comfortable in that, we will be happy to release it to you. I do not know whether that will be today or not. Are there other questions about the communities putting prevention to work?
Now, while we waited to get data from CDC, which we eventually did, but in the meantime, we contacted all 50 states directly. I just want to give you a couple of samples of what we found. In California, they took 13,000 specimens, and of those, 296 were swine flu, 12% were other flu, 86% were negative for flu altogether. And in Florida, they had 8,000 specimens, more than that actually. 17% proved to be, upon further testing, H1N1. 83% were negative. In Alaska, 1% was swine flu. And in Georgia, 2.4% was swine flu. The rest were negative for swine flu. We want to make sure that people understand we're not trying to downplay the seriousness of swine flu, which it can be very serious, but there's a risk of overreacting, and you had an example of that.
We had an example at our own paper, and this was early on in the process when people weren't sure what to do. We had a reporter stranded at an airport with lots of incoming flights from Mexico, developed serious respiratory infection, went to a hospital, and was immediately put into an isolation unit for 4 days. He recovered from his illness. He was tested in the meantime, and about a week later, despite all evidence to the contrary, he did not have swine flu. It can be mistaken for a lot of things, and the trouble is right now, if everybody thinks they have swine flu, the use of the medicines out there, the vaccine, the use of the Purell hand sanitizer, which could backfire and make your bacteria resistant to that, all of that could become an issue of overuse, and that's why I think it's important right now, the agencies, to figure out which is which.
Fred Barbash, it's hard to balance it, and in this Brookings Institute study, they're talking about the high cost of closing the schools, but by the same token, I guess there would also be a risk and a cost to keeping them open and allowing for an untethered spread.
They don't think that cost is as high as some people do with their study, and admittedly it's limited data because it's, things are happening right now. Their study shows that the ability to sort of prevent the spread by the time you close the school is significantly less than people think. So they're not arguing that schools should not be closed when people think it's necessary. They just think that people ought to carefully weigh the cost and the benefits. As Alicia said, there needs to be a chance to sort of calm down, even though this is obviously an epidemic of some sort. There is an epidemic of some sort, and consider what you're doing before you're doing it. And that's the Brookings study, which we'll be talking about on Politico's website later. That's really what it's asking. Weigh and balance the costs and benefits before you just go ahead and make a move that really has a big knock-on effect.
Thanks to Fred Barbash of Politico. We'll check out Politico.com. You can also look at CBSNews.com for the full investigation on this topic. And thanks to Alicia Mundy, also of the Wall Street Journal. That's Washington Unplugged for today. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. You can find us here every weekday at 12:30. And don't forget to catch my Follow the Money reports on the CBS Evening News with Katie Couric. Have a good day.
I think it's really dangerous to make any assumptions as what's going to happen over the next few weeks or months. It could have peaked and then might come down. That would be wonderful if that happens. Or it could peak and then taper off like this, which means there'd be many more cases of influenza. Or it could peak, come down, and then in the middle of the winter, we could have a second wave.
Brass Check TV, free to you, not free to us. We've got a server bill, we've got an email software bill, we've got a tech helper bill, and that happens every month. So to everybody that is supporting us financially, that's paying for their subscription in one way or another, we really appreciate it. If you're not, consider doing so. Everybody's got money for the newspaper and the cable bill and all that. Do you have money for media that's actually serving you? That's really the issue here. And when you help us, it allows us to get this information out to the world. So thanks to all our supporters, and if you're not a supporter already, please consider becoming one.